I'm putting this series of videos and images together to show off me building a custom shifter kart, which is pretty much a go-kart, but it has multiple gears. The real initial aim of this project was to improve my fabrication skills, whether it was welding, cutting, grinding and drilling, or really any other metalwork. So the main focus was originally to perfect the frame design, as this is where most of this metalwork was going to happen. I used a program from Autodesk called Fusion 360 to make a frame design, which I meant to follow as the project went ahead. But as it did, I began to notice that some things weren't corresponding to the design, or parts that I did not yet have, I couldn't account for. So for example, the exhaust coming out of the engine block, I didn't take that into account, so I put the engine block right behind the seat. But that would have meant that the exhaust had to go through the seat. So that's just one example. So in the end, I had to change a few things just to make everything fit together. To start off with, I had to find an engine, and more specifically, I was looking for an engine with large displacement, preferably larger than 125 cc's, as they seemed a little small to me. On top of that, I needed one with a starter motor, which just allowed me to start the engine without having to get out of the cart. I ended up finding a Chinese brand Pitbike, which had everything I needed: a large displacement of 250 cc, an electric start, and as an added benefit, the motor was upright, as opposed to the usual 125cc engines that you find in pit bikes, which are flat. This allowed the engine to take up less space. With the engine now taken apart, I began mocking up the parts, finding the measurements that fit my body size so I could implement them into the CAD. I also managed to find someone selling the front suspension and steering shaft of a quad bike and an already assembled rear axle from a go-kart, which I later implemented into the CAD. In order to do all the welding on the project, I bought an arc welder. I began welding the frame according to the CAD, using metal that I had brought from the scrapyard. Once the rear of the frame was complete, I started making the motor mounts for the engine. In order to do that, I used the engine's original motor mounts, which connected it to the frame of the pit bike, and also using the foot peg mounts, where I just welded a bar across the frame and then bolted the engine to that bar. I began mocking up the front suspension the way that I wanted it, using my phone to take pictures and drawing to visualize my ideas. And then I began welding the front two parallel bars, which would house the front suspension. And then in order to strengthen the frame, I used some angle iron in order to hold it all together. I continued to mock up the front suspension with the pedals as well, and then once everything fit, I welded everything together, including the tabs for the front suspension. When I finished welding the front suspension, I noticed that when the wheels were put on, there was some really bad positive camber when you turned them, so I ended up having to cut the front part of the frame and angle it up about 30 degrees, which seemed to fix that issue. In order to strengthen the suspension components, I welded a cross member between the tops of the two struts. The tie rods were a bit short, so I had to cut them in half and then weld a little extension bar, because from the quad they were just a bit short. And then the bottom of the steering column, I just slotted through a hole that I made between the two frame rails. With the steering complete, I mocked up the motor and I made a shift lever which I could access, which was connected to the shifting mechanism on the motor. And so when you pushed forward on the shift lever, it went down a gear, and when you pulled back on the shift lever, it went up a gear. With everything loosely connected, I started to notice that the exhaust was very close to the seat, so I had to start thinking about making a new mount. I was originally thinking of making some engine mounts which would place the engine directly over the sprocket on the axle, but I found that that was a bit too difficult, so I had to find another way. I decided to mount the engine to the right side of the seat using the foot peg mounts that I used for the original engine mount and welding it to the right frame piece. And then using the brake rotor from the old axle, I cut it up and then drilled some holes in it in order to make a firm and strong engine mount. At this point I decided that the red seat that I was using before was just too weak, so I ended up buying a go-kart seat from eBay and made some mounts for that as well. I then changed the gear shifter connector between the two levers, just bent it a little bit so that it could reach. And then in order to hold the fuel tank and all the electronics, I cut the frame of the Pitbike where the engine came from and then connected it using the rest of the engine's mounts. From the beginning I was planning on using these hydraulic brakes that I took off of the Pitbike itself, but as time went on and the brake pads just weren't pushing enough on the brake rotor, I decided to save up some more money and buy myself a mechanical brake caliper, which worked perfectly. I also forgot to mention that I stopped using the old go-kart axle that I bought from the guy who was also selling the front suspension of the quad, and I made my own using some parts off of eBay. The rear sprocket, the rear brake rotor, and then I had to find the hubs that would hold my rear wheels. But because I had bought specific car wheels that I wanted to use, I had a lot of difficulty trying to find a hub that would support the axle that I had and also the wheels that I had. So I ended up designing my own, and I went to an engineering workshop where they machined it for me, and then I fit it right to the axle. I connected the throttle line to the carburetor and the brake pedal to the brakes, and I had connected a battery to the starter, and then I tried to start the motor. In this video I also tried to engage the gear, but I noticed even though I had the clutch lever held in on the gear shifter, the gear engaged anyway and the wheels started spinning. So it was at that point that I started thinking that there was something wrong with the clutch. And this is also something that I ended up figuring out a little bit afterwards. In this video you can also hear that the engine's really out of tune. The fuel to air ratio is really out of whack. So when you press on the accelerator, the engine just kind of wants to bog down, which is something that you'll especially get to see in this video, where I also try to tune the engine a little bit so that when I do press the accelerator, the engine runs smoothly. In this video you'll have to excuse the quiet noise. I just had to turn down the volume because it was just torrential rainfall in the background. I managed to get the engine running smoothly, and this was me just playing around with the gears. At this point my idea was confirmed that even though you held the clutch lever in, the clutch engages no matter what, and I had to find a solution for this because there was no way that you could drive it without some way to disengage the engine from the gears. The issue becomes quite obvious in this video when I hold the clutch in and pop it into gear without letting go of the clutch, and it stalls the engine, even though at this point there shouldn't be any movement in the transmission as I'm holding the clutch in. I had originally thought that the issue was because the engine was sitting for a few months, that the clutch had gotten stuck to itself. So one way to fix that was to apply a lot of throttle and then just drop the clutch, and it should unstick itself, but that didn't seem to fix the issue. I tried to adjust the clutch as I thought that it was gripping too hard, but all I ended up doing was adjust it so much that the clutch never engaged, no matter what gear I was in. In the end, with a little bit of adjustment, I managed to get the clutch to engage properly, and this was the maiden voyage. Although short, it was definitely very, very satisfying. That's all that I have for now. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you very much for watching.